How many soldiers did the United States have in its land army during World War II? This is a deceptively difficult question to answer. The U.S. Army's strength fluctuated so much throughout the course of the war that coming up with a definitive number is more challenging than one might think. If we look at peak size, the U.S. Army reached almost 9 million soldiers by the end of the war. But this figure includes a lot of people who weren't involved in fighting, and it does not tell us anything about how the Army grew or when the Army was at its largest. This video will answer all of these questions and more. We will discover what the true size of the American Land Army was during World War II. We'll begin by looking at the size of the American Land Army in January 1942, just 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. At this point, the U.S. was at full war with Japan, but America had not yet declared war on Germany or Italy. As such, most of the troops in the American Land Army were being trained for a potential conflict with Japan in the Pacific. There were 385,000 men in uniform in the Philippine Department under General MacArthur, although only 21,000 of these were combat troops. There were also 60,000 Americans in the Hawaiian Department under General Kruger, including 15,000 combat troops. In addition, there were 56,000 men in the Panama Department and 13,000 in the Caribbean. Of these 514,000 men in total, only 70,000 were combat troops. Most of the others were support staff, supply and logistics personnel, or were still undergoing training. In April 1942, the American Land Army had grown to 785,000 men. Combat troops now made up 17% of the total force. By June, the Army had reached over 1 million soldiers, of which 200,000 were combat troops. These men were spread out across the globe, from the Philippines to Hawaii, from Panama to Iceland, from the British Isles to North Africa. But for the most part, they were still engaged in training. Aside from a few thousand troops in the Philippines and a few dozen in Iceland, none of these soldiers saw any real combat until late 1942. In November of that year, American troops finally went on the offensive. Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, kicked off on November 8th, 1942. 2 days later, George Patton's troops secured a beachhead near Casablanca. On November 11th, American forces began landing at the westernmost point of the invasion, west of the Moroccan city of Safi. These were the first combat landings of the American military in World War II. Over the next few weeks, American troops would secure positions along the Moroccan coast and gradually push inland. By December, 100,000 American soldiers were stationed in North Africa, a number that would grow to 350,000 by the end of the month. As the American armies grew in size, so too did the strain on the American economy. More and more American men were leaving their jobs to enlist in the military. Factories that had been producing consumer goods like cars and refrigerators were converted to produce weapons, ammunition, and other military supplies. Women entered the workforce in record numbers to take over the jobs left behind by the men. Despite all this, in December 1942, Congress passed the first peacetime draft in American history. Nearly 90% of those eligible for the draft enlisted or were drafted into the military. By February 1943, 500,000 men had been inducted into the Army. 370,000 of them were still in training, but 130,000 had already been sent overseas. As such, the American Land Army had grown to 1.2 million soldiers by the end of February 1943. This figure included 300,000 combat troops. But the army was about to get even larger. In March 1943, the Soviet Union requested that the United States open a second front in Europe by invading Western Europe from the south. This plan called for an American invasion of the French coast at the easternmost point of the Bay of Biscay. The target date for the invasion was set for May 1943. This operation was codenamed Operation Husky. In order to build up the necessary forces, the U.S. planned to send 60,000 reinforcements to Britain in the first quarter of 1943 and another 60,000 in the second quarter. It seemed logical then that the U.S. would reach its peak size in mid-1943 before the American invasion of mainland Europe, but things didn't quite work out that way. In May 1943, the U.S. Army reached a size of nearly 1.5 million soldiers, with 525,000 of them being combat troops. This was the largest army that the United States ever had during World War II. But just 2 months later, the army had shrunk to just under 1.3 million soldiers. So why did the American army shrink so dramatically in the summer of 1943? The reason was casualties. Between May and July, the U.S. invaded and fought in the Italian campaign, most notably the Battle of the Salerno beaches. In total, 3,600 Americans died during the Italian campaign between July and August. In addition, thousands of others were wounded or missing in action. When you consider the fact that the entire American army at this time consisted of around 1.3 million soldiers, even just a few thousand casualties represented a significant percentage of the total force. But this was only the beginning. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the U.S. suffered nearly 80,000 casualties. This single battle would cause the U.S. Army to drop from 1.4 million soldiers in December 1944 to just 935,000 lives in January 1945. During the final months of the war, the U.S. Army would fluctuate between 850,000 and 1 million soldiers as millions more Americans were drafted and sent to fight in Europe and the Pacific. By September 1945, the U.S. Army had fallen to 575,000 soldiers. Just 3 months earlier, it had stood at over 9 million. Although most of these soldiers were combat troops, it was still surprising to see the army shrink so dramatically. The American public expected the war to last well into 1946, but the rapid collapse of Germany and Japan meant that the U.S. no longer needed so many soldiers. On VE Day, May 1945, President Truman ordered that military demobilization should be carried out as rapidly as possible. Military service during World War II ended for most men once they had been discharged or mustered out. But some members of the armed forces were retained for an additional 90 days to assist with the demobilization process. These men were known as the 90-day wonder. They typically wore civilian clothes and received half pay while they waited for their separation from the military to be finalized. By December 1945, the American Land Army had shrunk to 165,000 soldiers. Just 2 years earlier, it had stood at over 1.5 million. So what was the true size of the American Land Army during World War II? The answer depends on when exactly you want to include the army. If you're referring to the army's peak size, then the answer is nearly 9 million soldiers. This number was achieved in September 1945. However, if you're referring to the army's size on a particular day, then the answer is 1.5 million. This occurred on May 1943. Finally, if you're referring to the army's average size, then the answer is around 1.3 million soldiers. This figure can be obtained by dividing the total number of soldiers served by the number of years the war lasted. Thanks for watching.